happy to be back here today with former Sergeant Beaver Shaw from the Rhodesian Airforce. Our last couple of interviews seem to have attracted a very, very positive response from people all over the world who have expressed great interest in knowing more about Beaver's experiences. And I've had a little bit of time since our last chat to go and have a look at his book, and there's an enormous amount of interesting information in there which we'll never be able to cover in the course of these interviews, but I've selected some areas of interest which I'd like Beaver to tell us about in person. And so yeah, very good to be back here with you, Beaver. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Hannes. It's good to be back, and I'd like to thank everybody for their support with my book.
Great. Going through Beaver's book, one of the stories that caught my eye was an incident where wildlife were used to help in pursuit of the war effort, and I want Beaver to tell us that story himself. It's quite a remarkable story.
We were operating Fire Force out of Karoi, and we were called out to a big sighting on a river line just outside Karoi. And RLI were the Fire Force, and we had sticks on both sides of this river line in stopper groups, and the terrorists that went into some real thick bush, and while we were doing our orbits, they were just harassing us constantly with small arms fire, taking pot shots, and RLI couldn't get anywhere close to them because of the thickness of the bush and the amount of rounds that were coming out at them, and they couldn't see them. So everything was static for a while, and while this was going on, I saw on the opposite side of the river, I saw two buffaloes. They were old Duggar boys, just standing there, and they were aware that because they could hear all the firing and stuff, and they weren't happy, but they were just standing there, and they weren't sure in which direction to run. And I thought to myself, there's only one way to get these gooks out of here, because we don't have any way of flushing them out of this thick bush. So I thought, wonder if I just fire some rounds next to the buffalo and see if I can push them into the thick bush where the terrorists are hiding. So I double tapped, I fired some rounds, and they ran, and they seemed to run in the right direction. Got to the river, I fired another burst near them, but not close enough so that the shrapnel would whack them. And they did exactly what I thought they'd do, and by now these buffalo were wild. They hated the sound of the HE rounds hitting the ground, so they went into the bush. And as they were going into the bush, the terrorists saw what was happening, so they started firing at the buffalo. But I think the 20mm round HE was much more of a deterrent than the little AK fire that was coming up in front of them. And these buffalo just tore through through this bush, and the terrorists came bombshelling out in all directions. Some of them are even dropping their weapons. They were just so shit scared of what was happening, and it was just a field day. I took about 4 of them out that day, and that was the end of the contact. And no one killed. 5 to the buffalo, and 0 to the Fire Force. It was great.
And then you flew back the next day, and there were the buffalo, happily sitting in the sun.
Yes, there was nothing wrong with the buffalo. They didn't take any bullets. I think those gooks were just probably firing way above their heads, as they normally do. So the terrorists didn't know which way to turn. And luckily the buffalo were just aggressive enough to just tear them out of their position. I wouldn't like to take on an angry buffalo, as you know.
Some years ago, a lady historian from Harvard University came to visit me, and she was wanting to do research for a book or something on the Salute Scouts, and I at the time was working with Ronry Daly on his memoirs, and it turned out she was less interested in the actual Salute Scouts and more interested in the atrocities committed by the Salute Scouts. And I explained to her that I wasn't familiar with too many atrocities, and I believed that if they had been committed, we would have heard a lot more about them. And so I was of very little assistance to her, but she was quite insistent, and she said, but surely there must have been rapes and other illegal actions carried out by the Rhodesian security forces. And I said, well, I'm sure there were, but what I can tell you from personal experience as a young soldier in the RLI was an incident where I was part of a fire force reaction, and a group of terrorists had been pinpointed by a Salute Scout observation post in a village, and we responded, and some of the terrorists were killed, and unfortunately there were a few civilians that were caught in the crossfire. One or two were killed and a few were wounded. But in the sequel to the contact, one of the lance corporals purloined a small transistor radio from one of the huts in the village and stuck it in his pack and took it back to Mount Darwin. I think the same day, the district commissioner in Mount Darwin arrived at our base to inform the major that a report had been received from a village headman to the effect that a radio had been stolen in a village by a member of the security forces. This individual was immediately asked to produce himself. The radio was handed over. He was severely disciplined. I think he was demoted, and he suffered some other punishment as well. I can't remember exactly what. But this was the standard that the Rhodesian Army was expected to meet in conducting itself in the field of fire. So I said to her, you know, if there were excesses carried out, I really believe in most cases they were dealt with by the disciplinary authorities, and the Rhodesian Army operated at a very commendably high standard in the way it conducted itself. I don't believe that the enemy can claim the same sort of behavior. Much has been documented, but the world media was very, very studious in ignoring the bad behavior of the enemy, while constantly on the lookout for any reason to report bad behavior on the part of the Rhodesian security forces. And so in that context, I want to hand over to Beaver and ask him to tell us a little bit about some of the experiences he had in responding to civilian casualties that were meted out by the enemy in the course of his time as a technician.
Saw a lot of atrocities during the Rhodesian War committed by both Zanda and Zipper terrorists. Some of them that come to mind, the first one being the worst one being the Elam Mission massacre, where the terrorists came to the mission station at Elam Mission early in the evening, and they got all the missionaries out of their buildings and took them to a playing field where they started bayoneting the men, took some of the women, raped them and bayoneted them to death, and one of the missionaries' woman had a baby, and the baby was bayoneted to death, and we had to go in and help the security forces with the follow-up and everything with the people that had been killed. I remember very distinctly that night actually having to land in the bush with the fire force because we'd run out of light, and it was a pretty wet, bleak night, and nowhere to sleep. We put our sticks around us as security, and whoever could tried to sleep. I took a stretcher out of one of the casualty stretchers out of my chopper and tried to sleep on it, but I couldn't because the stretcher was full of the missionaries' blood, and I'll never forget that as long as I live. The sight of those poor people being butchered by these terrorists. Another incident that I can recall is when we were called out to a village that belonged to some RAR soldiers in the Gutu area. Most of the RAR actually came from the Gutu area, and obviously through a telephone call to a police station or whatever, we had to go and casevac some woman that had been brutalized by the terrorists. We arrived at this village with some RAR sticks, and we searched the village and found most of the men in the village killed, and these women, obviously as a sign to the rest of the RAR, they'd raped the woman all night, and then sometime during the night they'd taken grass and balled up the grass and stuck it into these women's private parts with diesel and set it alight. And I think, if I recall, there were 4 women, and they were just completely burnt in that private part area with this burning grass and diesel, and they were in a pretty bad way. And one thing that I'll never forget is when we picked up the woman and we took them to the chopper, they refused to lie on stretchers. They walked to the helicopters, and I remember these 4 women sitting in the helicopter and flying all the way back to the base, to the base hospital where we were going to sort them out, and they never even whimpered. They just sat there stoically looking at me, and it's something that will also stick with me for a long, long time. That will always be in my mind is that of an old farmer, grubstaker, an old rogue, but he was a bit of a recluse. I knew him from school days, and his name was Fred Kroenen, Fred, as everybody called him. An old Afrikaner that lived in the Mateke Hills, and with his local wife, and he'd kept very much to himself. But with all the activity and terrorist attacks going on in the Mateke Hills area, the police decided that Fred needed to move from his little shack in the bush and be moved to a more populated area where they thought he would be safer. Anyway, they sent a BSAP scouter patrol out to where Fred's farm was. The patrol consisted of a couple of Land Rovers and a Bedford truck to carry all Fred's worldly possessions, and they loaded everything on and headed back probably closer towards the Cherezi area to put Fred where they were going to. I'm not sure where the place was, but they were moving him. And on the way out from Fred's house, the convoy hit 2 vehicles in the convoy hit landmines. One of the vehicles, the lead vehicle in the Land Rover, a few policemen were really badly injured, and in the middle vehicle, Fred was sitting in the back of a Bedford truck, which hit a landmine with a right rear wheel, and which Fred was sitting right over, and he got blown off the truck and really, really badly injured. So the call sign, the BSAP call sign, called us in Cheredi and asked for Casovac to come out and with doctors. So we got the local doc and we headed straight for the landmine incident area. Got there, landed, and the medic got out and started doing his triage and asked me to help. And I went across to where Fred was lying, and I picked him up. He was lying on his back, and I lifted him up, and I said to him, Fred, I know you, I remember you, you're going to be okay. We've come to help you. I'm going to put a drip in you now, and then the medic will come and attend to you, but you're fine, you'll be okay. I know you're hurting, but we'll give you something for that. And he said to me, Cian, don't worry about doing anything. I'm dying. And he said, I want you to hold my hand. He said, hold my hand. So I held his hand, and he said to me, you know, one thing is, I know that I'm dying, but I'm not dying alone. I know you. And he said, I'm glad that I'm not going to die alone today. And not long after that, he just had a gasp and he died. And it was quite a sad day. Another incident that sticks in my mind is that of the second Viscount that got shot down. I was operating with Fire Force in the Karoi area, and the day the Viscount was shot down, we had a contact going on all day on one of the rivers near Karoi, and we had stops up and down the rivers, and we were firing quite a few rounds at the gooks. We were getting shot at. The RLI were doing their bit, and the contact actually went on into the evening, and I remember firing the 20 mil in the evening. It was one of the first time I'd actually fired that 20 mil at night, and I was just astounded by the muzzle flash firing at night. Anyway, during the fight, we were told to stop immediately and return back to Karoi, which we did. And we arrived at Karoi, and everybody was scrambled to the police ops room, and we were told about the Viscount being shot down. At that time, it was too dark to get to where the Viscount was, so we waited till the morning. In the next morning, we had a briefing, and the GCARs were tasked some to take journalists and some to take police and Air Rhodesia people to the crash site. At the football grounds where we were operating from, near the police station, it was complete chaos. I've never seen people like the journalists and the media behave so badly. They were tearing at each other, they were kicking and screaming, trying to get on a helicopter to get to the crash site. And I never personally went to the crash site because I was in KCAR, and we had other tasks to do during the day with follow-ups to the scene. But from what I gather from the guys that were at the scene, it was pretty horrific.
In my view, the unsung heroes and heroines of the Rhodesian War are the farming families, the men, women and children who struggled under the most difficult of circumstances to keep their farms running and stay alive at the same time. It was very, very difficult to defend them because of the size of the country and the scarcity of men and resources. So they were left for much of the time to their own devices, and it took enormous courage and commitment to prevail under those extraordinarily difficult circumstances. But I know that Beaver has some very interesting accounts to relate and this is an area of interest I want to leave to him to go into some detail about. Beaver, just tell us a little bit about the system that was in place to try and mount an effective defense, and some of your experiences in responding to the farm attacks.
Okay, Hannes, the farmers came under constant attack right from the time of the crocodile gang, and things escalated in the Centenary, Mount Darwin area, which necessitated the farmers to start arming themselves, putting fences around their properties, putting anti-rocket protection on the windows of their farms, and led to them having a system called AgriAlert, where each farm had a radio, and the radio was connected to the police stations and ComOps, and from ComOps callouts, if a farm was being attacked or farmers were being attacked, if they had any chance of getting to their radios, they would call for assistance, and then immediately, once ComOps had ascertained that we could help, we would be called out as a fire force if possible. But a lot of farm attacks were at night, and the helicopters could only fly at night if there was a visual horizon and a full moon.
I've just finished reading a book on the rescue of the passengers on board the ocean liner Oceanus, which went down off the Transkei coast of South Africa sometime, I think, in the late 80s. And it turns out that the hero, well, there were a few heroes, but from a flying point of view, Chas Goatley probably emerges as the guy who flew right through the night in incredibly tough conditions to rescue the people from the sinking ship. He much later was awarded, I think he received an American Congressional Award for his efforts on behalf, because there were Americans aboard the ship. But I know he's one of the pilots that Beaver worked with quite extensively during the Rhodesian War, and I want Beaver to tell us a little bit more about the famous Chas Goatley, who incidentally also had spent a little bit of time in the Slammer, having been on the Seychelles attempted coup. So a very, very colourful individual, but I know a very skillful and brave pilot who Beaver can tell us more about.
Chas Goatley, what can I say? An ex-Fort Victoria high school boy. His brother went to school with me. Chas was a little bit older than me, and I was on 6th Squadron with Chas when he went through his pilot training course, both on Provis and Vampires, and then on to 7th Squadron with Chas, where I flew with him for many, many hours in action in the K-car. Mostly my time with Chas was mostly in K-car, and we operated all over Rhodesia, and Chas was a natural. He was a natural commander and very, very good running scenes, and sometimes Chas would run the scene after scene without any help from the army commander. He was very cool under fire and an excellent pilot, and could multitask, and I really enjoyed flying with Chas. One incident, I was with Chas, we were flying in the Shabani area, and we had some terrorist visual. We were in the orbit, and I saw we were pretty low level for some reason, and our nose was onto the terrorists with a gun away from them, and I looked across and below Chaz's feet, and I could see the guys firing at Chaz with an RPD, and I could see the rounds striking the perspex, and right in between Chaz's feet and coming through the instrument panel and the windscreen, and Chaz never even blinked. He took it so coolly, and in fact he was so pissed off he kicked rudder and virtually dropped the barrel onto their noses and told me to take them out. What an incredible experience. And I will recall another famous experience with Chaz in Botswana. That'll be a little bit later in this interview. But Chaz was such a cool operator, and I had very much respect for him. There were other good KCAR pilots that I can't go through this interview without mentioning. Another of my best friends and pilots is Keith Spence, and we fought many battles together, Keith and I really enjoyed his coolness under fire. We flew GCARs and KCARs together. We operated with Don Price in the Matenga, we operated in the Sengwe, Malapati, went on externals with Keith. Also very, very cool and excellent KCAR driver, and I'd say a commander of troops on the ground. These guys were special, and I'm proud to have worked with them. Keith retired as a airline captain with SAA with a really, really good career, and those guys I will always hold in high regard. Another memorable occasion with Chaz was when General Bob Rogers came to Rhodesia to have a chat to all the South Africans operating them. So we were all positioned to Ngezi Dam, where it was away from everybody, and General Rogers could have a chat to the troops. And while we were having this chat, the 5-Force alarm went off, and we were called out to another contact. We got airborne as quickly as we could, went to the scene, which was just a little bit to the north of Bangala Dam, where BSAP were in contact with quite a large group of terrorists. There was 2 KCARs at the scene, and I think 8 GCARs, because the South Africans had come to speak to their commander, Bob Rogers, who was a great friend of Rhodesian. And anyway, the KCARs were flying overhead, and we kept not being able to make contact with this one call sign of Patu guys on the ground. So Chaz said to me, "Beaver, we're going to go down and we're going to give them a radio." I wasn't too happy about it myself, because there were lots of terrorists in the area. But Chaz had made his decision, and we landed to the one side of the contact area and shut down. And Chaz said to me, "Follow me, I need support." And we jumped out of the KCAR and ran into the contact, and we saw the call sign, gave them the radio, and then while we were giving them the radio, we came under quite a lot of fire from the terrorists who were hiding in a riverbed in the area, and I could see the dust of rounds coming right between us, where we were lying in contact with these terrorists, and a South African GCAR flew overhead, and one of the engineers, Toiki, took out the terrorist that was firing at us. And Chaz and I, as soon as that had happened, Chaz and I ran as fast as we could back to the helicopter, and our back on the KCAR was facing away from the contact area, so it seemed like about a day before we managed to get the engine started and the rotors running and being able to blow out of there. It was one of our better days with Chaz and his decisions. But Chaz was an aggressive guy, and he wanted things to happen, and if the guys couldn't talk to him, then he'd make them talk to him. That was Chaz.
Over the course of the war, there were a number of white civilians abducted, mainly by Zandler, if my memory serves me correctly. And it must be said, in most cases, they were well treated under the circumstances. They weren't subjected to any gratuitous violence or anything. But the idea was to get them into Mozambique and utilize them for propaganda purposes, as far as I understand. And I know Beaver was involved in several attempts to find and recover these people, and I just want him to tell us a little bit about his experiences with these abductees.
Yeah. Two of the most prominent abductions that I can recall were John Kennelly and Yvonne Mulligan. But just for the purposes of this video, I'll tell you the story about John Kennelly. Fire Force were based in the Bight Bridge area, and we just finished our mission in the Bight Bridge area, and we were tasked to set up in Victoria Falls. So it was in the afternoon. We decided to head off to Vic Falls. I was flying with a G-car with Mike Borlace, and we were going to go and land at the Drummond's farm and stay at the Drummond's farm for the night, and then head off to Vic Falls the next day. So on our way to the Drummond's farm, we were flying over the Bulawayo Bight Bridge Road, and we saw a big Pantechnicon heading. It wasn't far outside Bight Bridge, heading towards Bight Bridge, and there was a youngster in the front of the Pantechnicon, and he was waving like crazy at us. So we waved back. Inside the G-car was Mike Borlace, myself, and his English sheepdog called Doris. Anyway, we waved back and we continued flying, and within an hour we were at the Drummond's farm. We were told to get back to Bight Bridge immediately, and which we did. Got to Bight Bridge, and we were told that there'd been an abduction of a white person sitting inside a Pantechnicon, and his name was John Kennelly. So we went back straight into follow up with Don Price and 1NF RAR, and we had trackers, and we flew for days and days. We had many contacts in the follow up, and we were minutes away from John, but these gooks managed to get him out into Mozambique, and he ended up in the Chamoyo area with the Martins guy, and survived the war and was released later on. But I always wondered what happened to John until after the war. We met up with members of his family, and I found out that Mimi Kaywood and her family had helped the Kennelly family in their time of grief, while looking, not wondering what had happened to John. But one interesting thing is, over the next year or two, whenever we operated in the Matenga area and we had a contact, we used to look in the political commissar's a little bag where he kept his notebooks and stuff, and we found lots of notes written about John Kennelly and notes about where he was being sent. So we had quite a lot of int on John Kennelly. It was an interesting story, but for the terrorists, they did an amazing job of getting him out with that intense follow-up that was made for him.
One of the more famous people killed in the course of the Rhodesian War was Lord Richard Cecil, who was I think the great grandson of Lord Salisbury, Robert Salisbury, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time of the occupation, and thus the city of Salisbury came into being. Richard was a Guards officer who actually wanted to come out and join the Rhodesian army, but the family were very friendly with the Van der Bijl family. P.K. Van der Bijl, I think, was Minister of Defence at the time, and he explained to Richard that he would be doing the country a bigger service by operating as a sort of as a war journalist, and to try and get the story to the world about what was actually happening, and not what the BBC and the rest of the media were actually telling the world. And so Richard got access, along with his cameraman, a chap named Nick Downey, to the operational areas. And being a trained soldier, he was very well equipped to take on this difficult task, which he did with gusto and with great courage. The series was called, I think, Frontline Rhodesia. Some of the footage is still available, but he was killed in an area that escapes me. But I want Beaver to tell us what he knows about the sad day that Lord Richard Cecil was killed.
The day Richard Cecil was killed, we'd been operating with Richard and Downey for a number of weeks, and they were actually going in embedded with two RAR. Major Dennison was the K-car commander that day. I was actually in a G-car, and we were doing a wide orbit around. Richard had gone in with the first wave of fire force, and he was busy filming, and it was really thick bush that he went into, and he got shot by a terrorist, and it was a very short time, and Richard died, and picked up by a G-car and taken straight out. The biggest recollection of that day was it was the first day that I ever operated the K-car in anger. And basically what happened is, after Richard was killed, our G-car was sent back to base, and we picked up the spare K-car and went straight into the area and went into action. And it was a bit difficult for me because I'd had no training on the 20mm, and I wasn't even sure how to put the belt in to get it to work properly, but there was so much pressure on us that day. I did it, and it was the first time I'd seen action.
It was May, early 1977, I think, that there was a zipper attack on a village near the town of Gokwe, and this then triggered a response, which I know involved Darryl Watt and some of Pete van der Riet, I think. They were actually at the time doing an officer's course at the School of Infantry, but being the experienced soldiers they were when this attack took place, they were summoned from the School of Infantry and put on the tracks. And I know Darryl was leading the follow-up when they were, for some reason, replaced by the RAR, and a major contact ensued. And I know that was a sad day for you, Beaver, because it was the day you lost your great friend Rob Nelson. But maybe you can tell us the story of what actually ensued that day.
Yes, Hannes, it was a devastating day when I heard about Rob's death, and nearly a year later, his brother Kevin. But going back a little bit, Rob was a 32 LAR, I was in 31 LAR, but we were very, very good friends. Rob being an ex-Guinea fowl boy and a very good rugby player, friends with everybody, everybody used to call him Mouse Nelson. We were very close. We did a lot of bush tours together, and we both had girlfriends in Gwela at the time of his death. And Rob came to me a week or so prior to his death, and he said to me, Beaver, you've been tasked to go to Thornhill and do tour there. Can I not take over your tour? And I'm supposed to go to Rhodesia, and we swapped tours because I haven't seen my girlfriend for a long time, and she lives in Gwela. And my dad, operating in the veterinary department, was in Rhodesia at the time, and it was a no-brainer, so we swapped tours. And from what I gather, Rob was killed flying with Roger Watt, and they were doing the follow-up with Darryl Watt doing the tracking on the ground, and the RAR, I think the RAR were involved in the contact, and Roger was carrying some National Parks tracking team into the area to assist with the follow-up when their helicopter took fire from the ground, and a round went into the putt-putt. We had fuel-driven putt-putts to refuel the aircraft at the time, and a tracer round went into the putt-putt and set the fuel in the tank of the putt-putt alight, and the round went into the main fuel tank, and the fire spread from the putt-putt into the main fuel tank of the helicopter. Roger was probably about 800 feet on the ground and went into auto-rotation, and when he went into auto-rotation, the helicopter was quite fiercely burning, and I think some of the National Parks guys actually hung out of the helicopter to get away from the flames, and Rob's side of the helicopter was engulfed with the flames, and he jumped out of the helicopter at about 300 feet, and obviously with his flak vest and helmet on, and hit the ground, and he was killed instantly. What a terrible day. And yeah, it still affects me to this day. My book's dedicated to Rob, and it was also bad news a year later when Kevin was killed. Kevin joined the squadron, and he wanted to avenge Rob's death, and he got killed on an external op. What a bad day that was too. And many years later, I'd just written choppertech, and a guy called Pete de Klerk said to me that he knows Mr. Nelson, and we said, well, Mimi and I want to go and see Mr. Nelson, so we went to an old age home in the Free State, and we met up with Rob's dad. What a really nice old man he was, and he never even knew the story of how both his sons were killed, and we gave him a copy of choppertech and spent a couple of days with him, and we were in touch with him until his death. And yes, the whole Nelson story is a very sad part of the war. Two brothers killed in action in the same squadron.
An area of interest to me is the South African involvement that was stepped up after the accession to power of P.W. Botha in South Africa. P.W. Botha is a controversial figure, but he certainly was one of the few South African politicians who understood the big picture, in my view, and he could see that the demise of Rhodesia was not in South Africa's interests, and he was very forthcoming in providing military and air assistance to the Rhodesian security forces, which really came into play in 1979. And I know that Beaver had quite a lot to do with the South Africans, both in the air and on the ground. And I want Beaver to tell us a little bit about that collaboration.
My first operation with the South Africans was with Major Blau's Recce Battalion. They were based in Cherezi with us. They were just doing a trial op with the Rhodesians, and we were operating out of the Russian front. People like Tom Cummings. It was a very interesting op. They were sent into the Russian front, and their job was to destroy the railway line as much as they could. And they had actually using Bushman trackers, and Major Blau's group did a tremendous job. And then from then on, I never saw them for a long time. And then one day, Ed Potterson, our squadron leader, told me that I was going on a secret op with him and to prepare to be away for quite a while. We took a K car and we flew from Salisbury all the way to Madimba in South Africa, and we landed at Madimba, where we met up with also the Blau brothers with the Recces, and we spent a week or two in Madimba with the Recces, teaching them how to operate the same as we did as a fire force, which was a new concept to them, and they adapted very quickly. And within a week, we had our K car with a couple of South African G cars and 2 Pumas, and we headed back to Rhodesia, and we were going to be based at Bob Gawler's ranch. On the way in to Rhodesia, we got a fire force call out in the Bight Bridge area, and on our first contact, we killed about 40 terrorists for loss of no one. The terrorists were just overwhelmed because we could just put so many stops down using the Pumas, and it was an amazing event. From about 1978 onwards, South Africa started supplying air crews and helicopters from 17 Squadron into Rhodesia, and I was tasked to operate with a lot of these fire forces. I operated as a K car, and we always used the Rhodesian K car with a Rhodesian pilot and myself as the gunner, and the G cars would all be South African crews. Fantastic guys. I flew with guys like Rory Hulse, John Smith, Whitey van Heerden, some incredible engineers, and we had some really good fun times together, and some pretty fierce contacts. And the South Africans were incredibly good at what they did, and their crews were just as good as ours, and they fitted in perfectly. We loved the South Africans because whenever they came to Rhodesia on their tours, they'd bring us Bacardi and whiskey and stuff that we could never get, so it was really great. And I operated in Rutenga, I operated in the Lowveld, all over with the South African crews, and right up to election times we were still operating with South African crews. Pumas came in, and the saddest thing in my life was when it were all wrapped up and I saw all the South Africans packing up and from New Serum and flying off back to South Africa with their helicopters, and I was saying goodbye to them on the hard standing, and I actually cried that day.
Sure.
Yeah. One funny incident I recall is operating with Mike Borlace in Bight Bridge. We were based with Don Price at one end of near Bight Bridge, and Mike Borlace was always going across to Nottingham ranch to meet up with the knots, and he liked to go there. And early one morning, Mike decided that he wanted to go and visit the knots, and and have tea and play tennis. So he didn't really want me to go along, and I was somewhere with Don's guys shooting shit or doing whatever I do, and Mike went to his helicopter and flew off to the Knott's farm, played his tennis, and he came back. But if you know the one end of base, it was on quite a prominent feature with quite a big slope. And Mike came back from his tennis, landed the helicopter, and on the Alouette you've got a little handbrake that you pump on the left-hand side of the pilot's seat, where you pull your hand down and you pump it 1.5 times to get the brakes to work. Anyway, Mike landed and he shut down, but before he never put on the brakes before he shut down, so the rotors were winding down, and Mike pumped the brake, and the brakes didn't work; they failed. And Doris was used to running up. Doris was a big sheepdog, and she was used to running up to Mike and jumping in the helicopter when it shut down and kissing him hello and everything. So Doris was trying to chase the helicopter, which was sort of running down the mountain, and with Mike waving his arms, and there's nothing I could do because I was trying to hold on to Doris because I didn't want Doris to get caught up in the tail rotor. And all I remember is Mike going like this in the helicopter as it rolled down the hill, holding his dog Doris. But luckily for Mike, the helicopter found a flat area and came to a halt without the blades striking the tail boom or destroying the helicopter. So it was a funny day, and Mike never said very much. He just looked at me.